11 men were found buried in the backyard of a grief counselor in Ashford, Connecticut, each one clutching her business card in his decomposing hand like a final, desperate message from beyond. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Dr. Miriam Voss convinced 11 grieving women to trust her with their darkest pain, and why that trust made her the most dangerous person any of them had ever met. What you are about to hear is not a story about a monster who hid in the shadows. It is something far worse. It is a story about a monster who sat across from her victims in a warm, lavender-scented office, handed them a box of tissues, and told them she understood their pain better than anyone alive. She was right. She did understand it. She had created it. Ashford is a small town. The kind of town where people still leave their doors unlocked until October. Where the diner on Route 44 knows your order before you sit down. Where a stranger's face is noticed and remembered. It is not the kind of town where 11 men vanish without anyone asking questions. And yet, between March 2009 and November 2011, that is precisely what happened. 11 men. 11 separate disappearances. 11 grieving women left behind. The first was Gerald Hartley, 53 years old, a high school history teacher with a bad knee and a laugh that his students described as contagious enough to be a public health issue. Gerald disappeared on March 14, 2009. His wife, Donna, said he had gone to get the car washed on a Saturday morning and simply never came back. His car was found 2 days later in the parking lot of a Walgreens 8 miles from their home. His wallet was inside. His phone was inside. His reading glasses were folded neatly on the passenger seat, and according to the detective who first processed the scene, there was a half-eaten roll of Mentos in the cup holder, as though Gerald had expected to be back in the car within minutes. The engine was cold. The driver's seat was pushed back the way a tall man pushes a seat back, and Gerald Hartley was 6'2". Everything about that car said the man had stepped out for 30 seconds. Nothing about that car said where he had gone. Donna Hartley spent the first 2 weeks doing what most people do when their world collapses without warning. She called everyone Gerald knew. She made flyers with a photo taken at their niece's wedding the previous summer. Gerald in a blue tie, mid-laugh, eyes crinkled at the corners. She drove to every gas station and convenience store within a 15-mile radius and taped that photo to every surface that would hold it. She did not sleep. She lost 8 pounds in 14 days. By week 3, a friend from her church gave her a card. The card was cream-colored with a small embossed leaf in the top corner. It read, Dr. Miriam Voss, licensed grief counselor and trauma specialist. Compassionate care for those left behind. There was a phone number and an address on Birchwood Lane, and below that, a sentence Donna would later tell investigators had felt, at the time, like someone reaching through the fog and taking her hand. It read, You do not have to carry this alone. Donna called the number that same evening. She described Dr. Voss's office in her police statement 2 years later, and the way she described it tells you everything you need to know about how Miriam Voss operated. She said the office smelled like lavender and warm wood. She said there was a sound machine in the corner that played rainfall, steady and soft, and that it made her feel as though the rest of the world had been gently muted. She said Dr. Voss was sitting in a chair when she arrived, not behind a desk the way a doctor sits, but in a chair at the same level as the patient's chair, close enough that when she leaned forward, Donna could see the fine gold chain at her throat. She said Dr. Voss had green eyes and a low, even voice that never rose and never rushed. She said she felt, within the first 10 minutes, safer than she had felt since Gerald disappeared. And what investigators would eventually discover about every single one of the 11 women who sat in that chair is the detail that should make your skin go cold. They all used the same word. Every last one of them. Safe. Donna Hartley had her first session on April 9, 2009. She booked her second before she left the building. She did not know, as she walked back to her car through the cool spring air, that she had just handed herself to the woman who had buried her husband. Donna was not the only one. That is the thing that takes a moment to fully absorb, because when you hear the name Gerald Hartley and you hear about his blue tie and his half-eaten Mentos and his reading glasses folded on the passenger seat, you feel it as one tragedy. One man, one family, one wound. But Ashford, Connecticut was bleeding from 11 of them simultaneously, and Dr. Miriam Voss had positioned herself directly at the center of every single one. The second disappearance came 5 weeks after Gerald Hartley vanished. His name was Thomas Breyer, 48 years old, a plumber who coached Little League on weekends and made his wife, Sandra, coffee every morning before she woke up so that it was ready when she came downstairs. He disappeared from a Home Depot parking lot on April 19, 2009. His truck was found running, not parked and abandoned the way Gerald's car had been. Running, engine warm, driver's door hanging open, as though Thomas had climbed out to help someone and simply ceased to exist between the truck and the pavement. Sandra Breyer told investigators she had called his cell phone repeatedly and that it rang 6 times before going to voicemail, and that she could hear, faintly, in the background of that voicemail what sounded like birds. She received a card from a colleague at work 3 days later. Cream-colored, small embossed leaf, Birchwood Lane. She called that same evening. She used the word safe within 48 hours of sitting in that office. The disappearances continued with a rhythm that, in retrospect, should have alarmed someone sooner. Every 4 to 7 weeks between March 2009 and November 2011, another man vanished from the greater Ashford area. Another wife was left in the rubble of a life that had simply stopped without explanation. And almost without exception, 9 of the 11 cases confirmed, the other 2 strongly suspected. Each of those women found their way to Dr. Miriam Voss within 2 weeks of their husband's disappearance. Some were referred by friends. Some found the card tucked inside a sympathy envelope from someone they had met only briefly. One woman, Paula Sinclair, whose husband Richard disappeared in August 2010, said she found a card inside a book she had checked out from the Ashford Public Library. A book about navigating sudden loss, which was so precisely calibrated to her situation that she had wondered, briefly, who might have placed it there. That detail, the library book, the card tucked between pages 42 and 43 of a grief manual, was what first made Detective Ray Colton's neck prickle. Colton was the investigator who would eventually break the case open, and he described that moment in a 2013 interview as the first time the scattered disappearances stopped feeling like a terrible coincidence and started feeling like architecture. Someone had built this. Someone had designed the funnel and they were standing at the bottom of it, waiting. Miriam Voss had been in practice in Ashford since 2006. Before Ashford, she had worked for 3 years at a grief counseling clinic in Bridgeport, and before that, she held a position at a private therapy practice in Western Massachusetts. She had legitimate credentials, a legitimate degree earned at a legitimate university. She had letters of recommendation from colleagues who described her as gifted, perceptive, deeply attuned. She had, by all outward appearances, spent the better part of a decade dedicating herself to the care of people at the most fractured moments of their lives. And if you had walked into her office on Birchwood Lane on any given Tuesday afternoon, if you had sat across from her in that low chair with the rainfall humming in the corner and the lavender threading through the air, you would have felt it too. You would have felt seen. You would have felt held. You would have felt, as 11 women before you had felt, completely and devastatingly safe. What none of them knew, what even Detective Colton did not yet suspect at this stage, was that the safety they felt was a precision instrument. It was not warmth. It was a technique. Every question Miriam Voss asked in those early sessions, every gentle pause, every slow nod, every moment she tilted her head and said, "Tell me more about him," was extracting something specific. Not comfort. Information. She needed to know when the women were home alone. She needed to know their routines. She needed to know whether they had family nearby, whether their husbands had life insurance, whether there were children in the house. She needed to know the shape of the life she had already destroyed, so that she could determine how much longer she could operate before anyone pulled too hard on the thread. She asked these things in the language of healing. She packaged them in compassion. And the women answered fully and gratefully because the alternative was silence, and silence in a house where someone used to be is its own kind of suffocation. Donna Hartley attended sessions with Dr. Voss for 6 months. In that time, she shared everything. The layout of her home. The fact that her daughter lived in Portland and could not afford to fly back regularly. The slow realization that Gerald's life insurance policy would take at least 18 months to process without a death certificate, since there was no body. She shared, in her 5th session, that she had begun to wonder whether Gerald had left willingly, whether there was something she hadn't known about him, some other life running parallel to theirs. Dr. Voss had listened to this with an expression Donna described as profoundly kind. She had said, softly, that it was completely natural to interrogate the narrative we had built around the people we loved. That grief sometimes looked like doubt. That doubt was not betrayal. Donna wept. Dr. Voss handed her the tissues. The rainfall played in the corner. And Gerald Hartley had been in the ground for 4 months by then, 6 feet down in the dark soil of a backyard on Birchwood Lane, with a business card pressed into his hand by the woman now sitting 3 miles away, telling his wife that doubt was not betrayal. It was Detective Colton who, in February 2012, first noticed the connective tissue. He had been reviewing missing persons cases from the previous 3 years as part of a broader county-level audit, and the clustering of disappearances in and around Ashford had caught his attention. 11 men. A 32-month window. A radius of roughly 18 miles. No bodies, no evidence of foul play at the scenes, no common employer or social group. What they had in common, as far as anyone could initially tell, was geography and bad luck. But Colton had a habit, developed over 20 years in investigative work, of mapping the peripheral details. Not the victims themselves, but the people around the victims. Employers, neighbors, service providers. And when he began compiling the names that appeared across multiple victim families, the grocery store they shared, the church, the PDA, the doctors, one name appeared not twice, not 3 times, but 9 times in his preliminary review. A Dr. Miriam Voss, grief counselor, Birchwood Lane. He sat with that number for a long time. 9 families, 9 grieving women, 1 counselor. It was, on its surface, explainable. Ashford was a small town. A good counselor would naturally attract referrals. Word spread. Grief clustered in communities the way illness did. There was nothing criminal about a well-regarded therapist having a full client list. But Colton had been doing this long enough to feel the difference between a coincidence that explained itself and a coincidence that stood too still. And this one was standing very, very still. He pulled the business licenses. He pulled her professional registration records. He drove past the office on Birchwood Lane on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in his car for 11 minutes, watching the door. He noted the neatness of the property, the well-maintained garden at the front, the wooden sign that read Dr. Miriam Voss, Compassionate Care, hanging perfectly level beside the door. He noted the absence of anything that looked wrong. He drove home and could not sleep. 2 weeks later, he had confirmed 11 client connections. All 11 missing persons cases. All 11 wives. 1 counselor. He applied for a warrant. The warrant was initially denied. A grief counselor treating multiple clients from the same small community was not, the reviewing judge ruled, sufficient probable cause for a property search. Colton appealed. He gathered statements from each of the 11 women, carefully worded requests for their voluntary cooperation, emphasizing that they were not suspected of anything, that he simply needed to understand the full picture of their husbands' disappearances. Most of them agreed. Most of them mentioned Dr. Voss unprompted, describing her in the same reverent language, how much she had helped them, how lost they would have been without her, how she had been the one steady thing in an unsteady time. Paula Sinclair said something that Colton included verbatim in his case notes. She said, "I think she might have known those men somehow. She used to ask questions about them, not just about how I felt, but about them, what they were like, what they did, whether they had any habits she should know about. I thought it was just thorough. I thought she was just very good at her job." Colton stared at that sentence for a long time. Whether they had any habits she should know about. The second warrant application was granted on March 3, 2012. The search was scheduled for March 7th. Colton assembled a team. He did not yet have a specific target area. He was looking for documents, client files, communications, anything that might establish a pattern of contact between Miriam Voss and the missing men. He had not yet allowed himself to think about what he would do if the pattern was something worse than he was imagining. On the morning of March 7th, the team arrived at Birchwood Lane at 7:45. The front door of the office was unlocked. The rainfall sound machine was running. The lavender scent hung in the air like it had been there for years, soaked into the walls, the furniture, the carpet fibers. Everything was neat. Everything was orderly. The tissues were on the side table. The chairs were positioned across from each other at the same level, the same intimate distance. Dr. Miriam Voss was not there. But nothing could have prepared them for what was waiting in the backyard. The soil at the rear of the property had a particular quality that the forensic team's lead technician, a woman named Dr. Agnes Farrow, would later describe in her report as disturbed in a way that was too regular to be natural. It had been turned and settled and turned again multiple times in multiple locations. The ground had a kind of geometry to it if you knew what you were looking for. Farrow knew what she was looking for. They began digging at 9:17 in the morning. By 11:42, they had found the first one. Gerald Hartley was 6'2", and the box they found him in was custom-built. Not a coffin, not a crate, something built with care and specific intention, dimensioned precisely to the man inside it, as though whoever made it had known exactly how tall he was, exactly how wide his shoulders were, exactly how much space he would take up for the rest of time. His hands were crossed over his chest in a posture that was almost ceremonial, and pressed between the fingers of his right hand, creased and soft from the earth and the years but still legible, still carrying the weight of its embossed leaf in the top corner, was a cream-colored business card. They found all 11 of them that day. All 11 in custom boxes, all 11 in that same ceremonial posture, all 11 holding the card. The precision of it was what broke something in Colton. Not the bodies themselves, not the confirmation of what he had feared, but the care. The terrible, deliberate, suffocating care with which it had all been done. This was not rage. This was not impulse. This was a woman who had spent years perfecting a ritual, and the ritual was not just the killing. The ritual was everything. The cards, the sessions, the lavender, the rainfall, the tissues, the word safe. And as Colton stood in that backyard in the cold March air, the smell of turned earth rising around him, 11 women back in their homes still believing that Dr. Miriam Voss was the one person in the world who truly understood their pain. He pulled out his phone to call for additional units. That was when one of his team members came to the back door of the office and said, very quietly, that they had found something inside. In the locked room at the end of the hallway. The one they had initially assumed was a supply closet. It was not a supply closet, and the files they found inside it did not just contain information about 11 missing husbands. They contained information about 12. The room at the end of the hallway was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, and it had been locked with a deadbolt that did not match the rest of the hardware in the building, newer, heavier, the kind of lock you install when you have something worth protecting. When they got it open, the smell that came out was not lavender. It was something older and drier, the smell of paper and closed air and time, and underneath that, something else that Colton couldn't name but felt in the back of his throat like a warning. The walls were shelved from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves were files. Not the standard manila folders of a clinical practice, not the loosely organized patient notes you would expect from a working therapist's office. These were bound, carefully, individually bound in dark covers, each one labeled in Miriam Voss's handwriting. A small, precise script that one of the forensic analysts later described as almost architectural in its neatness, as though each letter had been placed with the same deliberate intention as everything else she had ever done. 11 of the files bore names Colton already knew. Gerald Hartley, Thomas Breyer, Richard Sinclair, 8 more. He recognized each one the way you recognize the names of people you have never met but have spent years carrying. Names that had become weight, had become obligation, had become the thing that kept him in his car on Tuesday afternoons staring at a wooden sign that hung perfectly level beside a door. The 12th file was thinner than the others. The name on the cover was David Mercer, and below the name, in the same precise handwriting, was a date, November 19, 2011. 3 months ago. 3 months before the warrant. Before the search. Before everything. David Mercer had not yet been reported missing. Colton called it in and then stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment, not going in, just looking at the walls, at the careful architecture of what Miriam Voss had built in this space that no client had ever seen and no colleague had ever been invited into. He was trying to understand the scope of it. Not the criminality, he understood the criminality. He was trying to understand the mind that required this, that needed not only to do the thing but to document it, to organize it, to return to it and review it the way another person might return to photographs of a garden they had grown. She had cared for these files the way she had cared for the boxes in the ground. With attention, with ceremony, with that terrible, suffocating precision. Each file contained, as the forensic team would spend the following weeks cataloging, a complete dossier on the victim. Not the husband as he had existed in the world, not his employment records or his public history, but the husband as he had been described inside that office. The husband as filtered through his wife's grief. His habits, his routines, the route he drove to work, the time he left the house on Saturday mornings, his preferred hardware store, his favorite parking lot, the gaps in his daily life where a person could disappear without immediate witness. The files were built from session notes. Not clinical observations, extractions. Every question Miriam Voss had ever asked in that room about the men was in those files, collated and cross-referenced and distilled into something that read, in the words of the lead prosecutor at trial, like a hunting manual written in the language of compassion. They found David Mercer 3 days later. He was in the backyard, in a box, in the same posture as the others. His file had been thinner because she hadn't finished it yet, or perhaps because she hadn't needed to. 3 months in the ground. The card was in his hand. His wife, a woman named Carol Mercer, had not yet reported him missing because he had told her he was leaving on a 2-week work assignment in Vermont, and she had been waiting for him to come home, and he had been under the soil of Birchwood Lane the entire time. When Detective Colton arrived at her door on the afternoon of March 8th, she answered it with a phone in her hand, already looking past him the way people look when they are expecting someone else, and the particular devastation of that moment, the split second before her face understood, was something Colton told people he carried with him every day for years afterward. The file on Carol Mercer was in the room too, in a separate section on a lower shelf. Not a file on David, a file on Carol. And that was when the scope of it expanded in a way that made the already cold March air feel colder, because Carol Mercer's file was not retrospective. It was not a file assembled from grief sessions she had already attended. It was prospective, preparatory. The referral had already been arranged. A card had already been placed. They found it in the outbox on Miriam Voss's desk, ready to be mailed, addressed to a neighbor of Carol Mercer's who had already been identified as the most natural person to pass the card along. The machine was still running. It had simply not yet completed its cycle. Miriam Voss was apprehended 4 days after the search, in a motel outside of Worcester, Massachusetts, approximately 90 miles from Ashford. She had not fled in the way investigators had initially feared. No false documents, no flight risk, no evidence of a long-prepared escape route. She appeared, when the officers arrived at room 114 of the Red Roof Inn on Route 9, to have simply stopped. The room was neat. Her clothes were folded. She was sitting in the chair closest to the window, not watching television, not on the phone, just sitting. One of the arresting officers said she looked up when they knocked and that her expression was the thing that unsettled him most. Not fear, not defiance. Something closer to resignation, he said, except that wasn't quite right either. He struggled to find the word for it for a long time before settling on the one that stayed with him. She looked, he said, satisfied, like someone who has finished a long piece of work and has had a few days to sit with the completion of it. She was charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder. She did not enter a guilty plea. Her defense attorneys mounted a case built around psychological complexity, around trauma in her own history, around the argument that the pathology driving her behavior was itself a kind of sickness that the court was obligated to weigh. The prosecution dismantled it methodically. The files were the prosecution. The boxes were the prosecution. The cards, 12 business cards, 12 dead men's hands, were the prosecution. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. She was convicted on all 12 counts. At sentencing, the judge gave her 12 consecutive life terms and said something that was reported in several Connecticut papers the following morning. He said that in 31 years on the bench, he had sentenced people for crimes of passion, crimes of desperation, crimes of greed, crimes of rage, and crimes of fear, and that he had learned to understand, if not forgive, the human failures that produced each category. He said he had no such category for this. He said the crime was the care. That the most disturbing element was not the violence but the sustained, methodical performance of compassion in its service. He said he hoped she would use whatever years remained to her to locate in herself whatever it was that had once known the difference between holding someone and consuming them. She did not respond. She looked at the middle distance in the same way the arresting officer had described, and she was taken from the room, and that was the last public record of Dr. Miriam Voss making eye contact with anyone. The 11 women, 12 now with Carol Mercer, were left to do the thing that Miriam Voss had always told them she alone could help them do. They grieved. They grieved twice over, which is its own category of suffering that does not have a clean name. They grieved the men, and they grieved the safety they had felt in that room, the safety that had been real in the way that a beautiful thing built on a rotten foundation is real. You lived in it, you breathed it, it held you, and then it didn't, and you had to find a way to reconcile what it felt like with what it was. Several of them sought counseling from other providers. Several of them could not, for a long time, sit in a room that smelled like lavender. Donna Hartley, who had been the first, said in a 2014 interview that what she missed most was not the sessions but the moment before them, the drive to Birchwood Lane, the moment she pulled into the parking lot and felt the day's weight lift slightly, the 30 seconds of pure relief before she went inside. She said she missed the believing. She said losing the grief counselor was almost as hard as losing Gerald, because when you lose a person, you lose them once, but when you lose the belief that someone understood your pain, you lose every session retroactively. Every moment of feeling seen, every tissue, every soft nod, all of it rewinding, all of it reconstructing itself into something that was never what it appeared to be. The rainfall sound machine from the office on Birchwood Lane was catalogued as evidence and eventually decommissioned. The building itself was sold, rezoned, and became, in a development that feels almost too deliberate to be accidental, a flower shop. And if you live near Ashford, Connecticut, and you drive down Birchwood Lane on a Tuesday afternoon, you can park outside it and look at where the sign used to hang and smell whatever is coming through the vents of the new business. Something green and soil-scented, something alive, and understand that the ground remembers what we put into it and what we ask it to hold. Miriam Voss understood grief because she manufactured it. She studied the wound because she was the blade. And she operated for 32 months in a small town where people left their doors unlocked, because nothing about her looked like a door you needed to lock against. That is the thing to carry from this story. Not the horror of the backyard. Not the boxes or the cards or the files on the shelved walls of a room that smelled like closed air and intention. The thing to carry is this. The most dangerous thing a predator can do is learn your language. Learn the words that open you. Learn the specific weight of your specific pain and how to hold it just long enough to make you believe they are the only one who can. Because once you believe that, once you feel that particular bone-deep safety, you will answer every question, fill every silence, and hand over every piece of yourself you were asked to share. And you will do it gratefully. And you will not know what it cost until the ground tells you. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.